Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the moderator of the next session, Susan Walton.
Hello and welcome to everyone turning up early on a Saturday morning. It's great to see that the room is actually so full, so thank you for coming. My name is Susan Walton, and don't let my funny accent fool you. I am American. I was born and raised there. I'm also a Briton. I've lived in the UK for the last 40 plus years, and I'm also half Slovak, and that's part of my connection with GLOBSEC. At GLOBSEC, I am an associate senior fellow, and I cover the financing of defense and security with capital and private markets. I'm also a senior advisor at ODI in the UK. And here in the Czech Republic, and I have many friends here from it, I am vice chairman of CERGE-EI, the US foundation that supports it. So thank you very much for being here. I'd like to introduce my fellow panelists, please. I'd like to start with Vladimír Dlouhý. He is president of Eurochambres. Marek, Kapička, director of CERGE-EI. Martin Kocher, former Federal Minister of Labor and Economy of Austria. And Ivan Mikloš, president of MESA 10 and former Minister of Finance of Slovakia. Gentlemen, please sit down. I'd like to set a little bit of context for what we're going to discuss today. Our topic is the 2025 Economic Security Outlook, and we're going to focus on Europe. Mark DeVos actually wrote a piece in the FT recently, and I'm going to summarize it very quickly. European nations have become conscious that the European project is now a hard power project that needs a geostrategic footprint beyond its current boundaries. We've been here before. In the early 1950s, post-war Europe tried and failed to institutionalize political and defense cooperation. Back then, it was American prosperity and a European economic community that enabled peace and prosperity. Today, we are fending for ourselves. With economic development subservient to geopolitics, failure is simply not an option. So fiscal buffers are eroding just as strategic demands intensify. Defense spending is rising, supply chains are being recalibrated, and industrial policy is back in fashion. Yet questions persist about Europe's capacity to grow, compete, and remain secure in times of mounting pressure. At the same time, the notion of a unified transatlantic economic alliance is being tested. Diverging priorities of trade, climate, and subsidies are straining coordination between democratic partners. It is the idea of a shared economic front amongst like-minded nations still viable, or are we entering a more fragmented and transactional global economy? These are the big questions that we are going to be exploring. Now, for me, what I hear from this summary is a big questions of resilience. And I'd like to start, please, with Marek Kapička. And Marek, how should we define resilience in economic terms?
Okay, thanks for the question. So let me start at, of course, there's lots of talks about how to reorient the economies to make them more resilient. The way I would think about this and the way the economist thinks about this, that this should not be a complete overhaul. I mean, one of the biggest assets are economies that are functioning efficiently and without too many regulations. And there might be a little bit of a threat of going too far in this direction and imposing broad tariffs to just make the economy more self-sustained. I think that would be a mistake. The way to think about this is perhaps an add-on, as supplements, very targeted supplements to an otherwise functioning economy. Perhaps the way to think about this, if you're an economist, is to think about some kind of a national security externality coming from certain sectors, perhaps, or activities. And once you start thinking about externalities, economists usually know what to do. We know how to regulate externalities. For instance, a firm importing critical minerals will take into account certain things. Will take into account that there's going to be an increase in price of those minerals in case of a conflict, but will not take into account that it has an effect on the country's bargaining position in case of a conflict. So that really is the externality, that the actions affect the bargaining position of the country, and that's not taken into account. So perhaps the way to think about this is to have really, identify the sectors where those externalities are the largest, and do very targeted interventions. But there are several problems with this. First of all, what are the critical sectors? And that's going to depend as well on what kind of a conflict you have in mind. If you think about a trade war with the US, it's a very different conflict than with Russia. It's a very different conflict than with China. So there's lots of unknowns, and more work needs to be done to identify this. And one last comment. There is a danger of going too far in resilience as well for strategic reasons. And if you become more resilient, it's likely that the opponent will become more resilient as well. So it improves your bargaining position, but as well theirs. And so the net effect is not clear. And second, there's perhaps a danger of becoming too resilient within a group of allies. So if let's say every country in the European Union is too independent or resilient, it's going to reduce the willingness of other countries to help in case of a conflict. So there are those strategic considerations that needs to be taken into account and weigh all the costs and benefits.
Thank you very much for putting that in such great perspective. As you were mentioning about transatlantic partnerships in China, I have a question actually for Ivan, who actually you run Eurochambres, which represents 60% of EU employment for SMEs. And so what is the growth potential of the European economy relative to its transatlantic partners and to China?
This question for Vladimír, I think.
Oh, I'm so sorry, Vladimír. Okay, apologies.
That's fine. We know each other for such a long time. We have known each other. That's no problem. Well, let me start to provoke a little bit. We got, in preparation to this panel, we got just 5 points about Europe. First, what is the growth potential of the European economy relative to its transatlantic partners? My answer is low. Second, can Europe sustain rising defense spending without sacrificing long-term competitiveness and fiscal health? My answer as to fiscal health, no. Are macroeconomic conditions, rates, inflation, debt, supporting or undermining Europe's economic security goal? Undermining. Is meaningful transatlantic economic coordination still realistic, or is the concept of democratic economic alliances losing ground? Losing ground. What are Europe's strategic options in a world of contested globalization and increasingly transactional partnerships? Are there any options for Europe in the short run? I don't think there are not very many. But back to your economic resilience question, because in general, I tend to agree with what has been said here before. Let's have a look at the sectors. Let's also consider the strategic issues. I would very much underline, for instance, should we retaliate against Donald Trump's tariffs with all that list for 95 billion euros, which Maroš Šefčovič has somewhere in the drawer? What Marek said, I would be rather careful. But if you are asking me about my membership base,
yes,
about 20 million small and business scale entrepreneurs in Europe and also affiliated country. For them, indeed, the problem of Europe lagging behind, not only over the last 20 years, but last 40 years, is about deregulation, simplification, scaling up the economic policies towards deepening single market, even calling for the capital union, because even small and medium-scale enterprises, especially the startups, do not have appropriate access to capital in Europe compared to the United States. It's about the skills, and it's about the security in the economic sense. But the main economic sense, that means the issue of the very high prices of energy in Europe, especially electricity and gas, securing the supply chain, not only in the critical minerals, but in many other things. But the main problem, which I'm getting back from all the surveys which we do, is about simplification, deregulation. Let's take, for instance, the Green Deal and all the ESG regulation. Europe has been bureaucratized since the 60s. But with the Green Deal and the ESG regulation, it has been even more regulated. We have all those reporting directives. Who does know something about corporate sustainability due diligence directive, corporate sustainability reporting directive? Then we have CBAM, we have many other things. The large companies, they can hire all those big auditors. They pay a lot of money for this reporting because of the regulation, and because they are usually the price makers on the big markets, they can pass the cost to the prices. Small and medium-scale enterprises don't have money for that. They usually increase the cost because of it, because they are price takers. They cannot pass it to the market, and it further on undermines their competitiveness. With all this, we made a great job for the auditors, for the law companies, and for general advisories like, I don't have anything against Deloitte or EY, but it's a great business. It's a great business for them. And some people are beginning to say, and this is only my personal view, that why don't we abandon, for instance, the Green Deal and ESG targets? Now, soon Europe is going to reconfirm the Green Deal targets for 2040. When I'm saying that, I'm being accused that I'm anti-green, anti-European. No, I believe it's enough if you look outside the window and you see that there should be something done with the climate. But targets, sanctions, and regulations will not change the climate. It's going to be the investment into the modern technologies, into the green technologies, which indeed at the end of the day are going to have a positive effect on the climate change. And I'm afraid that if I look at other regions, like United States, well, with Trump, I don't want to look much at the United States. Okay, let's say other regions who do not have such a target, who do not have a straitjacket of the regulation, and still they are able to invest much better. They are much more productive, much more competitive, even in the green technologies. And I would bet, and I'm too old to see the results, that in 30 years, even these regions will be able to face the problem of the climate change better than Europe is today, with all is leading by example that we are going to be the most aggressive in fighting the climate change. And this is being reflected more and more also from the small and medium-scale enterprises.
That's very interesting, as small to medium-sized enterprises are the backbone really globally of all economies. What I hear you saying is that a regulatory compliance is terrifically and horrifically expensive for small companies. And you mentioned access to capital. A couple of other panels that I led really talked about access to capital and how hard or easy that was here within the EU. Within the various countries that you are operating in, are you finding that, for example, sort of bank financing or other routes to which there is access to capital, some are better than others? Is it easier in Germany versus Austria or Czechia?
Well, definitely there are the differences. In the Eurochambres have 38 countries, including countries like Georgia, Turkey, Western Balkans, etc. In the core EU countries, there are also differences, but the general attitude is that to a certain level, even the startups Of course, in Europe, they use basically bank financing, commercial financing. And even the West European startups, for instance, when they reach a certain level, they very often just incorporate in either Singapore or the United States or else, because there must be a deepening of the capital market. We are speaking about it. Well, Enrico Letta now doesn't talk about the capital market. He speaks about saving and investment.
The Saving and Investment Union, yes.
But it's basically a capital market. You know, sometimes I used to be a friend of those Czech conservative old Eurosceptics, and I am now considered to be a traitor because on one side I'm saying much less Europe in regulation, etc. But at the same time I'm saying, especially now when we are facing the dangers globally, when we are facing hostile American administration, we need more Europe exactly in the capital markets, in deepening the single market, etc. So it's some type of a middle way where we are going to abandon some of the reasons which definitely brought us to the situation where we are lagging behind many other regions in the world, and at the same time using the potential and Draghi's report with all those questions which you can discuss almost on every page, but in total is a very good report, and Draghi's report is clear. It's a blueprint. Just do it.
Thank you very much. That was wonderful. So that's on a very fundamental level. I'd like to zoom back out about macroeconomic conditions. So are the macroeconomic conditions of interest rates, inflation, and debt supporting or undermining European economic security goals? And I'd like to bring Martin in on this.
Thanks for the question, and thanks for having me. As always, it's difficult because politics tries to find excuses for not being able to do things that are necessary to do. And let's probably go back a couple of years when we had a perfect environment for investments in many areas and for structural reforms. There was zero interest rates. We had the peace dividend that was huge for many European countries. And when we look back, did the European countries and the European Union put forward those structural reforms and those investments? Partly, but not to the extent that would have been possible at that times. Now we are in a different situation. The situation is more complicated, macroeconomically speaking. There is the trade-offs that are within the economic decisions are more apparent now, which makes it, of course, more difficult. But I think in the end, when you look back in history, in economic history, decisions have to be taken when they have to be taken, and you cannot wait until the macroeconomic climate is perfect. And even if you wait, you would not be able then to push through the decisions that have to be taken. That means, of course, and I think that's very important to keep in mind, that means that the trade-offs we have to be actually mentioned, in my view, very publicly. Economists tend to think in trade-offs. Politicians tend to think in panaceas. There is no panacea. You need to talk about the trade-offs. And when we talk about economic resilience, when we talk about economic security, there's always trade-offs involved.
What are these trade-offs?
The trade-offs means it creates higher costs if you are more resilient. You cannot have everything. So some strategic papers, they want to keep the industry as it is. They want to bring back some strategic production to the European Union to become more sovereign, and they want to support new young companies, the startups Vladimír was talking about, and providing capital to those to quickly grow and become successful. And these are three different goals, and all of them have their merit. But doing that at the same time will be difficult given the budgetary situation, will be difficult given the capacities, the political capacities, and so on. So we'll probably have to talk more about these trade-offs and select, you talked about externalities, select those policies that give us the highest value added for the priorities we have to set politically. And I think talking about that is important because you cannot have all at the same time.
And in terms of like the priorities of these trade-offs, do you have a sense of what would be of the highest priority of those for the EU to consider?
So I think there's two different goals that the Commission has set clearly. One is becoming a stronger player and a more secure place. That means investments in security. The other one is becoming more competitive and regaining some of the competitiveness we've lost. And those two things go together in certain areas. In some areas, they go in different directions. But in some areas, they really go together. So there is not a trade-off in the sense that both cannot be achieved. But it requires, of course, decisions that are not easy sometimes to take. And of course, again, that's the problem we often have in the European Union. With some of the decisions, some countries benefit more than others, and the other way around. And that's of course sometimes difficult because then you have to go on this supranational level, which makes it difficult in the European Union. But I think the overall targets are achievable, and even there is some complementarities between those two large objectives of the European Union at the moment that can actually bring the two goals together. Actually,
that's actually a very interesting way to put it. So I'd like to now look at America as a driver around setting some of these priorities, and is a meaningful transatlantic economic coordination still realistic, or is the concept of democratic alliances losing ground? Ivan?
Yeah, thank you. Of course, times are very different now, but I still believe that transatlantic cooperation and alliance is inevitable for the future, despite of the current situation. But let's return back to Europe, because this is, I think, the most important. If you are speaking about resilience, the most important precondition for resilience is economic strength and competitiveness. It depends on competitiveness. Reality is that while US is holding the share of global economy during last decades on the same level, China, other developing countries are growing, Europe is failing, which means economic strength of Europe definitely is weaker. I'm old enough to remember that when I was first time finance minister, it was more than 20 years ago. In 2005, it was mid of Lisbon strategy. For those who don't remember, EU took in 2000 Lisbon strategy, which the main goal was to catch up US in the competitiveness till 2010. And in 2005, we have been in the mid of this, and as Minister of Finance, we discussed in ECOFIN again, why the gap is widening and not decreasing. And it is reminding me, I'm speaking about this because Vladimír mentioned the Draghi report, and the main conclusion of the Draghi report was that Europe needs much more single market, which we don't have completion. Europe has lack of investment, lack of innovation, over bureaucracy. This is exactly what we have been speaking 20 years ago. Exactly. That the Europe needs these reforms which will solve these problems. At that time, Jean-Claude Juncker, who was chairman of ECOFIN, famously said, we all, of course, know what to do, but what we don't know is how to win elections after doing this, which means I'm speaking about political costs and political difficulties of reforms. But now, because now situation is really new, really difficult, really on the edge, hopefully, because usually people are saying that politicians are doing what is necessary only after trying everything else. Which means hopefully now we are on the edge and this necessity is clear. And in connection with the US and with the trade wars, which already started, it is very interesting that, for instance, a recent IMF study showed that internal barriers inside of EU are such high that as it was tariffs for the goods on level 45% and tariffs on the services more than 100%, which means we have so strong so-called implicit tariffs and barriers for internal from 31% to 55% during last 15 years. No, last 25 years. In China and in US, it was increasing only from 34 to 37 and 23 to 25%, which means Europe was extremely opened to outside and closed inside. And in today's trade war situation, it is very, very detrimental. But at the same time, and for instance, for countries like Slovakia, Slovakian export share to GDP is 92%, which means at the present conditions of the closing the world and trade wars, it is extremely, extremely detrimental. Which means just to do some partial reforms in completion of single market, investment growth, innovation growth, deregulation, which is huge, and Vladimír talked about this, could bring a lot of opportunities for higher economic growth. Higher economic growth are necessary precondition for solving almost everything. I'm not saying everything, but if you are speaking about necessity to increase investment to the safety, to the military, to the solving the fiscal tensions, over indebtedness which we have, economic growth is the solution. But the problem, and let me conclude by this, because the biggest problem is not economic one. We know what to do. Diagnoses have been done, not only by Draghi, before by Letta report, Monti report, other reports. Problem is how to do this. And the biggest obstacle is not economic. The biggest obstacle is political. Because we are living now in the we are facing very complex challenges, geopolitical, international trade, security, and so on. At the same time, Europe is very fragmented. Which means, and how to overcome is not easy, because the biggest problem is that the European identity is still not enough strong to have one voice policy or common policy on the European level. At the same time, we have formal rules, veto right, not in every areas, but in some rights, which are detrimental in this regard, because especially small countries like, for instance, Hungary or Slovakia, unfortunately, today could block everything. That's the reason why those who really feel the necessity to do something are creating informal alliances, like in military cooperation, even in cooperation with UK, which some EU countries are excluded from this.
Can you give an example, please?
Yeah, example is this military cooperation, this coalition of willings, which UK and some EU countries, majority of EU countries, are now discussing about creating a new fund and doing much more investment to military. Yeah? And not all EU countries are invited there. Slovakia and Hungary are not invited to this discussion. Yeah? And in solving the problem for these economic reforms, is either to change these formal rules, but it will be very difficult, but if not, then to create informal coalitions which will change the things, to have much more common policy and one voice policy in these areas which are inevitable and necessary for increased competitiveness and economic growth of Europe.
It's very interesting, because I can tell you firsthand it's not appreciated in the United States. In the U.S. feels that its tariffs have this enormous impact all over Europe, and you're saying it's inter-European trade and regulation that is very stifling, and this is also what we heard from Vladimír as well. I would like to put this question back to Vladimír too, again, because you're at the coalface of this. Do you think that this deregulation has a very big potential driver, and it should be achievable, of economic growth within the EU and also in the other areas that you covered? Do you think that's actually achievable? And what are the barriers to it?
Well, the barriers still seem to me to be political. Yes, there is a substantial change in the new Commission compared to von der Leyen Commission 1. But the change is in words. The buzzword is not Green Deal anymore. The buzzword is competitiveness. We have all those omnibuses, because Brussels loves the slogan, so now the popular slogan is omnibus. Omnibus in terms of the regulation, omnibus for the chemical industry, omnibus for automotive, etc., etc. But to quote, I don't want to be too intellectual, but Shakespeare in Hamlet, I think Polonius is asking Hamlet, "What are you reading, my lord?" And Hamlet famously answers, words, words, words. What I want to see are the deeds. And this goes to your question. I am currently still not convinced that the urgent need, it's not about 5 years of the lasting of the von der Leyen's 2 Commission. It's about a year, about 2 years, how we really restart the good conditions for the especially small and medium scale businesses. Because of my membership base SMEs, I am maybe too much engaged in the regulation and simplification. Yes, there are many other things, and let me not go to that. Draghi's report and others are clear what to do. But let me also make last comment in this intervention about the politics, which Ivan mentioned. In the liberal think tanks, conferences like this, there is one elephant in the room. And these are the big populist parties, and the question why so many people are voting for those populist parties. Why even my membership base, the small and medium scale enterprises, not only from Central Europe, but many of them in Germany, in Benelux, in France, etc.
Why do you think?
Are more and more, well, we should ask that. We should not say that they are populist, they are bad, they are neo-fascists. We should ask why people are voting for them. And the answer is clear. These populist parties, despite of in the other areas, the political relations to the Russian-Ukraine war, relations to the migration, these are the parties which I would never touch. But in the area of the economics and the regulation, they very often say the same thing as I am saying here. And that makes them more and more attractive, because they believe that Europe is providing the straitjacket and these parties are against the Europe. So I'm going to vote for them, because if they win, they will remove me of the regulatory straitjacket. And it's as simple as that. So rather than to cry that what the hell is Donald Trump doing in the White House? Well, it's Donald Trump in the White House. We will not change it. We should ask why we have executed the policies over last 2 decades, since the famous Lisbon strategy, that brought us to the situation that we have Orban, we have Fico, we have half situation in Poland, and we're gonna have Babiš in the autumn here. Let's be frank. And why? Because Europe does not fulfill what the people would like to see.
And so again,
I'm a little bit sorry, when you are chairing an institution for 20 million SMEs, you become to be nervous, and I'm also old, so less resilient.
Less resilient. Actually, Martin, I'd like to put this question to you. So the context of it is the ECB projects the euro area GDP growth for 2025 far below the US and China. Meanwhile, defense spending is on the rise as a percentage of GDP by 2027. How can Europe reconcile sluggish growth with its ambition to compete globally?
I think that has been mentioned before by some of the speakers. Growth is, of course, and competitiveness is a precondition for having the capacity to invest in areas you want to invest in. So I think it is a clear objective to become more competitive and to have higher growth levels. Actually, even for the green transition, for the renewable energy transition, we need a certain level of growth to finance the investments that are necessary to achieve our targets. So this will be key. And we're talking very often about the short run, and you mentioned the forecast for the short run. I'm not so much concerned about the short run. I'm concerned more about the structural potential growth opportunities of Europe. And some of the things have been mentioned, the implicit tariffs within the European Union, the regulation. We haven't talked about the aging of the society. There's a couple of aspects that reduce our potential growth within Europe. And it's not possible for the European Union to respond to all of these structural concerns or structural challenges that we have. But there is a couple of things when you talk about the single market, when you talk about venture capital, when you talk about innovation, when you talk about technology, when you talk about the barriers within the European single market, all these things could be addressed and should be addressed. And as Vladimír said, there's lots of, I think, good intentions already here. The words he mentioned from Shakespeare. We'll see whether the Commission and the member countries will be able to pull it off. After all, I think, and that's important to keep in mind, the power of the European Union comes from the single market and perhaps from the region, the neighbors of the European Union, the extension potential that we have, the expansion potential that we have, accession of new countries. This is the power of the European Union. We are the largest economic region in the world. There is, economically speaking, still a very strong stance of the European Union, and improving that, advancing that will help to achieve other targets that we have, geopolitical aspects, security aspects. That's the way of thinking perhaps of an economist, but I think if you cannot achieve more competitiveness, it will be difficult to succeed in other areas where we think it's necessary to work together more closely.
Thank you. Actually, this is a good opportunity to for the audience, actually, if they wish to contribute some questions, you can do so through the Slido. It should be up here, the Slido hashtag, and I can pick those questions up and see it here. Yes. Okay. Actually, if somebody wishes, go right ahead, please.
Thank you so much.
Can you, can you say your name and the institution that you're from?
I'm Andrej Nosko and I'm from Slovakia. Just two remarks. The first one is, actually, some of this regulation that Mr. Dlouhý mentioned, they have explicit exemptions for SMEs. So either those companies that are worried about them are not SMEs, or we need to look at actually at the facts. And I think I'm also a little bit tired of the self-flagellation that we do in Europe. We sort of bash ourselves for how bad we are, but actually this is still among the top places in the world where people want to live. And I want to talk about the energy prices, because that's an area that I'm actually following and I can speak about. The high prices are unfortunately a function of the market that we try to create. We had bad economic policy in a very good time that actually led to populism that we right now are facing. And I think we need to also start thinking outside of the box. I mean, some of the regions that are most innovative are not most innovative because of the market, but because of the public investment and engagement in the economy. And we have to decide, because on one hand we say that the freer the market, the better, but actually what we see, the market failures are beyond what we can just simply regulate. And I think we need to really start looking for solutions that allow not only growth that creates and undermines our societies, but we need to think about the growth that actually maintains the reason why Europe is different from other places around the world. Because what people are expecting, they're not expecting economic growth. That is unfortunately given to 5 individuals owning half of the planet. But people are expecting that their quality of life will be good. Children are expecting that they can at least live as good as their parents. My question is actually, how can we maintain the European way of life and actually look at the new economic solutions and leave behind economic policy that I also studied that has been discredited as not based on facts?
That's a very good question. A panelist who would like to address that.
I'd love to. Well, sir, we definitely are not on the same page, but that's normal in the discussion. First, and you mentioned many things. Energy prices, yes, that I'm calling it a merit-based generation, for instance, of the electricity prices through those auctions. By the way, it was a model which for this country, Czech Republic, till the start of the pandemic, or rather till the start of the energy crisis, worked excellently well. The prices were relatively low. Now we have the vengeance, and the prices in Europe are 3 or 4 times, especially in our region, more than in many other regions of the world. I spoke to Commissioner Jorgensen from Denmark by the end of April, and I started with this question: Commissioner, what are we going to do so that we small and medium-scale enterprises do not face such high prices? And he said, in the short run, don't expect any solution. It's about the more investment into the renewables. It's more investment to the efficiency, which will slowly bring the prices down. So even from the mouth of the responsible commissioner, I heard that I shouldn't expect any short-term improvement, which is one of the most difficult issues for the European competitiveness into the future. And as to the regulation, again, I agree with one thing which was implicitly. I'm criticizing European Union. A lot of regulation goes also for the responsibility of the national governments, of the gold plating, different ways how the European directives are differently imposed in different countries. Each destroys level playing field. But we must deregulate. We must do something about that, because it will bring, as I said already, very strong political consequences. And if I may, because I said at the beginning we are on a different pages, I don't think that Europe is different. I don't believe in some special European way of life, that we are better than other regions. I even would go as far, and forgive me, that our European way of life undermined the efficiency, productivity, the zeal of several generations compared to other generations in other regions. So I wouldn't like to see Europe as some type of a special continent with a special way of life.
That's a very powerful statement. We have a Slido question that sort of speaks into that too, and I'd like to put this to Marek, please. GDP per capita growth over the past decade, USA versus EU, 27 to 22% versus 18%. So what is all the fuss about with such a high GDP growth?
Okay, so I guess, if you look at longer periods, we've got, COVID and other things in the past decade, but still, US is coming ahead, and it may not look large, but if you look really at the last 30 to maybe 35 years, then you see that small differences over years will just accumulate into a very substantial gap between GDP growth, between difference, and especially productivity difference between Europe and the US. If you go back to early 1990s. The productivity per hour worked was about the same. Nowadays, it's about 20% lower in Europe than in the US. And on top of it, Europe is working less. There's less labor market attachment, so that makes the gap in GDP per capita even larger. But it's fair to say that the US, we kind of think here about maybe the US being the ideal where we want to get. The US has not been growing particularly fast either. So this may not be. This may be a statement about problems on both sides, rather than that we're doing well.
Thank you. Marek has a lot of experience with the U.S. because you lived and worked there for a while as well. Actually, I'd like to throw the same question open to Ivan. I saw you taking some notes, and maybe put it in a bit of a context around. I'm getting lots of questions here about our energy and economic security, and as we are so reliant on undemocratic and unreliable regimes for our energy.
Yeah, a lot of questions have been opened, which means regarding US versus Europe, yeah, that's true. That difference is not so high, but over the time it is growing difference. But at the same time, it is necessary to say that the US has its own real problems. Yeah. regarding sustainability, income disparities, and so on, especially today, in connection with the negative consequences of the ignorant Trump's economic policy, not only in the tariffs, but also, for instance, now with this big, beautiful bill, which was passed and which is creating threat of fiscal unsustainability and so on, so on, so on. And also tensions, political tensions connected with this. Regarding criticism to EU, yeah, it is necessary to say that on one side we have here these problems which we already mentioned: overregulation, bureaucracy, a lack of single market, and so on, so on. On the other side, I have to say that usually we are not speaking about positives of the European Union. If, for instance, I can imagine that my country is out of the EU, not speaking about openness and dependent on the trade and economic relations, but also like fiscal responsibility. EU pressure and the growth and stability pact is creating really strong pressure to disciplinize the public finance. I can imagine that fiscal situation in my country could be much, much worse, if not EU. Then competition, which means anti-monopoly policy and regulation of the state aid and subsidies and so on. So foreign trade, if I can imagine that Slovakia is negotiating trade agreement with China or 500 million euro, which means there are a lot of positives which we are usually not mentioning if we are speaking about these things. And last point, the question about, because it was connected with the question about what is the reason of this growth of populism. And I agree that it is very, very complex phenomenon, but at least one factor which played important role was very non-existing policy in the regulating of the immigration, for instance. It is connected, of course, with the aging problem, which is a very serious problem for the Europe. But now it is clear turning, and I have to say that it was a very big mistake, because in every textbook of economic or state, you have protection of the external border is the basic obligation of every state. Of course, if we have Schengen, that we have common external border, which means there have been a lot of reasons why we are where we are. But now, for the future, and this is important for the future, I think because threat from this non-democratic country, and especially for the future, China, of course, is the biggest threat. The transatlantic cooperation and common approach to strengthening cooperation and resilience will be really very, very important and unavoidable. And one of the biggest problems of today's Trump's policy is that instead of trying to cooperate together to facing this threat, potential threat, which will grow. Because, for instance, I am convinced, and not only me, but the reality is that China's regime is losing steam. And this model is also because demographic reasons, also because other reasons. But when China will be growing less, the tensions and the risk of geopolitical conflicts will increase. Because the social conflict which exists, a social contract which exists in China, that communists have all power, but people's life is improving permanently, is not maybe sustainable. And if not, then imperialistic aggression is the easiest way how to hold popularity and power if economic and social conditions are not improving. We have seen it in Russia many times, last time 2020 till now, and this is something what is a real threat for the future, and it increases importance of the cooperation, transatlantic cooperation.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're about to wrap up here, and I want to actually throw a question to each of the panelists. If you can answer it very quickly, we've got 2 minutes. There was a lot of discussion around the opportunities and challenges around the structural growth here in the EU. And I'd like for you to each give me one example of each of what is an opportunity and what is a challenge. And we'll start with you, Vladimír.
What is the opportunity, you mean economic business-wise? Well, definitely use the single market and try to deepen it, and remove all the internal barriers which other colleagues mentioned. What is the biggest problem? Biggest problem or biggest threat is, I must say it, regulation and the slow speed of deregulation, combined with also what I tried to shortly mention, the political fragmentation of Europe.
Fantastic.
As
Marek?
the US is fragmented, Europe becomes to be fragmented as well.
Thank you. Marek?
I agree with what was said, but I'm just going to say something different. The opportunity perhaps might be defense spending. We know that if it's done well, it could contribute to productivity growth for a long period after the defense spending is gone. The threat or the challenge is how to manage that with the high public deficits, and that's...
Fantastic. Martin?
I'll try to say something new because I mean, lots of things have been said, and I agree. I think the chance that we have is being more innovative. Innovation is key, and the European Union has a big chance here to become at the forefront when we achieve business models out of innovation in a better way. And the threat, also a new one, I think I mentioned it briefly, the decline in the number of workers in the European Union, the aging of the society, is a threat that requires
demographic time bomb.
Demographic time bomb requires political answers on the level of the nation states mainly, not on the European Union level, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe if I'm thinking about this, opportunity is current crisis, which means opportunity is current threat.
Okay.
Because it depends how we will face this crisis. If correctly, it will be opportunity. If not, then it will be threat and problem.
Thank you very much. Thank our panelists very much. Thank you all for coming this morning.